I think I arrested the devil. A story by Voker3_16. I'm not entirely sure if the title is true. I know for a fact that whoever, or whatever I arrested, certainly was evil, to say the least. He appeared human, at least if you didn't look into his eyes. If you did though, there was something hidden behind them, a beast, something completely devoid of anything that was even tangible. All I could see was rage, and a twisted enjoyment of what he had done. We'll get to that later. I guess I'll start with the arrest. We, my partner Michael Briggs, and myself, were running our typical patrol of Ibley Street. It was everything you'd expect on a dingy Tuesday night on the bad side of town. Everyone looked suspicious, and even those who were most likely innocent didn't take kindly to a squad car rolling through the area. We'd had several shootings happen in the past 6 months. Now to us, they were all justified, but to the residents of Ibley Street and the surrounding neighborhood, we'd just as well have executed them without so much as a warning. So needless to say, we were not exactly feeling comfortable whenever our route took us through this particular area. The first hour was just as it always was. It's only when the clock hand begins to crawl past the 1 a.m. mark that things escalate. We saw 2 possible drug deals, but being familiar with the perpetrators from priors, we let them be. What's a little bit of weed being passed around when things such as gang shootings and heroin deals are far more impactful on the people of this community? Briggs and I made our usual small talk, talking about the impact the pandemic had had on the city, and especially this area. As if the economic downturn during the recession hadn't been bad enough, Ibley Street was overwhelmed with COVID cases. The situation had only gone from bad to worse, and in a place like this, that only encourages destructive tendencies. It was around 1:35 when we happened upon someone who we were not familiar with. This man stood out from the typical persons we would see walking outside at this time of night. His long peacoat was immaculate, which I could tell even from a half a block away. As he walked under a half-lit street light, his overall complexion was made obvious. He held a short wooden cane in his right hand, his left hand holding something, as he peered down at it. His black hair was slicked back, bordering on almost too greasy, as the shine of the light was clearly reflecting back off of it. A well-groomed beard covered most of his face, and his black pants were fitted well, only to be accented by what looked like the most expensive pair of alligator skin dress boots I could ever recall seeing. Briggs turned to me from his driving position and raised his eyebrows. "Well, you don't see that every day around here." I shook my head in agreement. "That's an understatement. Should we check him?" Briggs smiled a sly smile and said enthusiastically, "Shit yeah. It'll be better than the usual pimps and strung-out users we typically handle." He set our lights off, bathing the houses in the stereotypical red and blue that so often shone through the half-boarded-up windows. As well pulled up next to the well-dressed gentleman, he smiled at us and leaned down to view us better through the window. I could tell now that what he'd been holding was a brass, or perhaps copper, pocket watch. "It seems you're right on time," he said to us as Briggs rolled down his window to speak with the man. Again, everything about this man seemed off. What was he doing in this area of town? I had a suspicion that he may have been suffering from some mental impairment, maybe dementia or Alzheimer's. No one in their right mind, dressed as he was, would be caught dead in this part of town dressed like he was. I undid my seat belt ready to exit the car, a show of trust, at least in my opinion. To get out of the safety of our vehicle was always a bit of a risk, but if anything, this man seemed to be far more at risk. Briggs began very friendly with the man, which is far different than our usual tone when dealing with anyone at this time of night. "Hello sir. How are you feeling tonight? Are you okay? The man laughed, sounding very confident and almost offended at our doubt of his competency. Well, of course, why wouldn't I? Tonight is a beautiful night. The stars are covered, the air is thick and heavy, and I have been waiting for you to show up here, and here you now are. He spread his arms open wide and spun around in a way that a game show host would to welcome an audience. As I stepped out of the car, Briggs turned to give me a look that said everything in his expression. This man is off his fucking rocker. I stood up and looked at him over the roof of the car, his face switching between light and shadow as our bright warning lights would blink in and out. For a split second, as it was awash in light, I swear it had changed, if only for a moment, to something inhuman. But as it was darkened and lit up again, it had reverted back. Most likely just the way the light had fallen, I thought to myself. Sir, do you have any form of identification on you? I had a strong suspicion that even as I asked the question, the answer forthcoming was obvious. No, my dear boy. There is nothing on me but what you see. And of course, the watch that sits in my pocket. I had a feeling this was going to be a situation that could only be resolved back at the station. No form of ID, and most likely, given his mental state, no chance of true positive identification. I leaned back down to speak with Briggs. Can you run a cross-check to see if we have any missing persons for someone like him? Briggs nodded and began typing on the small police computer we had mounted on the dash. I shut my door and made my way around the car towards the man. His smile never left his face, and while it was friendly, something sinister seemed to lay hidden just behind it. I stood with a few feet between us, just as a typical side of caution was always necessary with our job. So sir, may I ask what your name is and what you're doing out in this kind of place so late at night? He held his hand out straight, prompting a handshake, and spoke enthusiastically, nearly shouting, "You can call me Stan. And you are Colin Porter, age 34, born in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And your partner here is Michael Briggs, age 36, born in Queensland, Georgia." The hair on the back of my neck stood up immediately. How the hell did he know that? Briggs shot me a look from the car and was obviously as perturbed as I was. Instinctively I moved my hand to holster. The situation, while still calm, now became somewhat murkier. Had we been targeted now? Who was this man? His demeanor didn't shift at all as I gripped my pistol. My dear boys, did I give you a fright? I simply wish to convey that I know you. I know you, oh so well. A tinge of sadistic pleasure dripped from those last few words as they left his mouth. Briggs waved me over, and I leaned down to keep him from having to raise his voice to communicate. Colin, I've got nothing matching his description in missing persons. Who the fuck is this guy? I turned to look back at him, his pleasant but unsettling smile still wide across his face. Well, at this point, I feel like we have to take him in. Something seems off about him, right? I asked Briggs, and he nodded, but then I could see disagreement work its way into his expression. What are we gonna put on him? Being a weird bastard? We've got nothing on him. I thought for a moment, and then looked around. This neighborhood was not an okay place for an older guy to be wandering the streets at night. Listen, either we get him off the streets, maybe label him as a danger to himself, or we watch the morning news after our shift and see a report about him being shot in the head by some gangbangers. Which would you want to do? I could see the hesitation in his face, and Briggs knew I was right. He sighed, and relinquished. Fine, but this fucker is getting cuffed. He gives me the creeps. I was relieved, but at the moment of decision, I felt an overwhelming dread wash over me. It seeped into every part of my being. Even as I walked towards him, his smile, though unchanging, seemed to suddenly take on something indescribable, an evil that was sitting in plain sight, that I couldn't see until this very moment as I walked up to him. It took every ounce of strength I had not to immediately turn around and simply leave him there to be ended or beaten by whoever wound up finding him wandering these deadly streets. But duty called, and I had to quiet the deafening warning bells happening in my mind. "Okay, sir, we're going to need dash," he interrupted me, politely at least, as he interjected, "No please, as I said, call me Stan." I shook my head, trying to clear the fog that seemed to be creeping into my brain from the injection of fear and loathing that was constantly growing from the sight of this man called Stan. "All right, Stan. We're concerned for your safety. This neighborhood is really not a good place to be caught in any time, but especially at this time of night. In the interest of your well-being, we would like to take you into our custody and down to our station. Perhaps there you could contact your family." Stan again opened his arms wide and spun around, and a slight giggle seemed to sneak out as he spoke. "This neighborhood, yes. Quite the marvel, isn't it? Afflicted by so many things. The agony of struggle, the putrid desperation of people trying so hard to escape the cycle of death and failure, only to inflict it upon everyone around them. It's nearly a work of art at how horrible this so-called neighborhood truly is. The Creator should be quite pleased with himself." It was at this that he no longer held back the giggle, a full-on laughing fit overtaking him. I looked to Briggs and he mouthed, "What the fuck" to me, and of course, that was the only thing we both were thinking. As he composed himself, he seemed to go back right to that distressing calmness we had witnessed as we had initially pulled up to meet him. "I apologize, my dear boys, sometimes I forget where I am. Of course, I will go with you if that is what you wish. In fact, I wouldn't have it any other way." I now hesitated. It wasn't just a physical reaction I was now experiencing. It felt as if my very self, the non-existent soul, screamed out loud. I had never experienced a fear like this that overwhelmed me, even during the shootout a few years ago. This moment, this man, or whatever he was, that stood in front of me, infected parts of me that I didn't even know resided within. But duty called. I gathered was composure I had left, which was essentially none, and put the required assertion of authority into my voice. "Stan, to maintain our safety, we will need to handcuff you. I hope you understand that." He responded immediately, jutting out his hands, his cane still held in his right palm. "Of course, Colin. I wouldn't want to be any danger to you." I peered at the cane. Its grip was concealed underneath his fingers, but I could tell the wood was well maintained, almost perfectly smooth and black, seemingly absorbing any light around it, including the bright LEDs that emitted from the squad car, similar to that Vanta black stuff that came out not too long ago. "Do you mind, if I take that from you?" I motioned towards his cane. He nodded, his smile still plastered onto his face. "My dear boy, whatever makes you most comfortable." He held it up for me, and I grabbed it by the length of it. The grip was revealed to be that of a goat head, shining in a magnificent gold. Its eyes were red, and I suspected they may be genuine rubies, similar to the ones I had seen at the Natural History Museum as a kid. The weight of it seemed to say that this was real gold as well, and not that plated stuff. No, that handle was full gold. For a moment I forgot the fear that had been gripping me, as I was mesmerized by this incredible piece of craftsmanship that I held in my hand. She's beautiful, isn't she? Made her myself. Real gold, and rubies as well. The wood is, well, special, I'll say. I barely registered what had been spoken to me, my eyes caught in the gaze of the red ones that shone so brilliantly on the goat's head. The bright lights of the cruiser making them sparkle, and I felt calm wash over me, finally. It's difficult to elaborate on what made them so mesmerizing. It was the sudden yell of Briggs that woke me up. "Colin, let's go." I was interrupted from this moment, and suddenly anger overtook me. "Shut the fuck up, Briggs." No sooner had those words left my mouth than I was suddenly very aware of where I was. I could see a look of shock and confusion on Briggs' face, and I immediately backed down. "Sorry, I was just lost for a second." I handed him the cane, and he stashed it into the passenger footwell. I turned back to Stan, my handcuffs now in my grip, and I asked him to turn around. He happily complied, placing his well-groomed hands behind him. I inched closer and placed the cuffs onto him, and heard a slight giggle peep out of him again. The feeling of distress began to inch its way back into my system, but this time I was able to shove it deep down, suppressing it, at least to an extent. "Okay, Stan. Let me know if these are too tight. I'm going to put you into the back seat now, okay?" Stan nodded politely, saying, "Of course, Colin, I'm sure you will take great care of me, just as I have of you." I wasn't entirely sure as to what he meant by that. I'm still not. I opened the rear door and placed him gently into the rear seat. He was very complicit, that ever-present smile not fading even a tiny bit as I shut the door, locking him inside. I made my way around the backside of the car, and finally sat back down into the familiar cloth embrace of the seat I had sat in for so many hours. It was nice, especially with the protection of a metal cage separating me and Stan. I could tell from the tension in the car Briggs was certainly pissed about my uncalled-for outburst a few moments ago. "Sorry, Briggs, I'm not sure what came over me." Briggs began to drive, shutting off the warning lights, letting the surrounding homes and abandoned buildings slink back into darkness. He grabbed the radio and spoke into it. "This is SC-66, we have a possible missing person with us, returning to Base 1 for drop-off and interrogation." I looked at him, a puzzled look making my question obvious to him. He leaned close, trying to keep his voice from being heard outside of my ear. "Whoever the fuck this guy is, I don't like him. He is not someone I want to mess with." Nodding my head in agreement, I knew he wasn't wrong. This man was not like any I had dealt with before. Something else was going on, but how was I supposed to know what exactly that was? Suddenly, out of the darkness of the back seat, that unnerving voice spoke again. "My dear boys, I'm so excited for this. These next steps are so crucial. And I can't wait for you to experience them." He giggled yet again, not hiding them, and I was suddenly aware that perhaps we should have left him on that god-forsaken street.